So today is basically the last lesson in Essential Ed for social studies. And as I mentioned, we're going to do, we'll start doing the unit quizzes tomorrow. We'll see how many we can get through. I imagine at least probably 2 or 3. We'll just see what time allows to get through those tomorrow. I will assign them later today. And then we'll move into some history, some civics, some stuff to give you the prior knowledge that's going to be needed for the exam. But today, comparing opinions and accounts. And the title doesn't necessarily capture everything that's going on in this lesson. Comparing, as it says in the description, compared to different treatments of the same social studies topic is a little closer. And we talked a little bit about primary and secondary sources in several lessons before this. And that's really more about what this lesson is being able to evaluate a source and understand whether it's a primary or secondary source, and then thinking about different treatments of a historical topic by looking at different accounts, looking at different times of when those opinions or accounts were written, and that'll help sort of build that skill set of understanding these different types of sources. So let's go ahead and take a look.
Hi there! Welcome to the lesson on comparing opinions and accounts. This lesson will teach you to compare and contrast opinions and accounts of the same social studies topic.
Yeah, so also looking not just at different types of sources, but then what we've sort of done in the past with comparing and contrasting by looking at 2 different sources that may have 2 different opinions and seeing what kind of information that we can sort of discern from that, and from looking at things from 2 different points of view.
When I was young, I thought history was a single true story. I didn't stop to think about how history is different depending on who's telling the story. There's some truth to the old saying that history is written by the victors. Slavers tell a different story than slaves. Conquerors tell a different story than the conquered. That doesn't mean that you, as a student of history, have to limit yourself to a single perspective. In fact, if you want to know what actually happened, you've got to look at things from a few different angles. 3 years ago, my grandma Nina, that's my mother's mom, passed away after a long illness. My mom and I went through and boxed up her things. We wrapped up her breakables, packed up all her clothes, and kept an inventory of everything. It was hard. We did a lot of crying and a little laughing. While we were going through Grandma's closet, we ran across a box of recent letters from my Aunt Mia. That's my grandma's sister, my great-aunt. This was surprising since, last I'd heard, Grandma Nina and Aunt Mia weren't on speaking terms. My mom and I read through the letters in a perpetual state of surprise. The 2 sisters had been writing one another for the last year, the entire time of my grandma's illness. And they made up. They worked out their differences with pen and paper. All it took was a dozen letters to change my view of my grandma. All it took was a new perspective. So let's talk about how to sort out some perspectives. You with me?
So I'm not a fan of that idea that history is written by the victors. We hear that a lot. Yeah, maybe initially. They give often the first accounts because they are the victors, and they sort of control the media, well, the narrative. But history is the study of the past. So as time marches forward and we investigate past issues and things like that, it's not the victors. There's usually some separation between whatever event and there has to be some distance for it to be given sort of a critical analysis. So that's thrown around kind of loosely, and I've never really like that. And the other reason I don't like it is because there are narratives out there that contradict history or offer a different perspective, and often those times they're troubling at times, but they are out there, and it's not always by the victors. There are people that deny the Holocaust, and that is certainly not history written by the victors. World War II being the Allies, that is a counter narrative to, well, largely what happened, of course. We see a lot of trouble with our own history that we'll talk about later when it comes to the Civil War and the Reconstruction of the South, and then the fallout of that. And that's something that still resonates because of a different narrative that's put forth by people. So it's a little simplified, I guess, that idea. But that's the other thing too. History, the facts of history don't often change. Sometimes they do. We get new information, and it might modify the way we, our understanding of something. But the way we understand history does change, and there's different sort of schools of thought about, the significance of an event and the cause and effect of it. And again, something like talking about slavery. That narrative has been changed as far as the impact and repercussions of that through things like the 1619 Project that the New York Times did. So while, again, facts don't often change, sometimes they do, but this understanding of history often does.
Before I get into how to compare texts, I'd like to talk about the best way to characterize a text. I like to walk myself through a series of questions. I usually start off with, is this a primary or secondary source? A primary source is something written during the time you're studying. So, if you're studying the Civil War, any document written during the Civil War is a primary source. A secondary source is something written after the time you're studying. Secondary sources, because they're written after the fact, are not written from first-hand experience. So an analysis of the Civil War written in the 1980s would be a secondary source. Primary sources tend to be accounts. An account is a first-hand report of something that happened. Secondary sources, since they're not written from first-hand experience, tend to be opinions. An opinion is a judgment may or may not have a basis in fact. That said, primary sources can be opinions and secondary sources can be accounts. Sometimes they might even have a mixture of the two. Every once in a while, you'll see something called a fictionalized account. A fictionalized account is a story that sounds like a first-hand account, but is actually an opinion. So keep an open mind and keep your eyes peeled. Next comes the questions of time and place. Where and when was the text written? Was it perhaps written in Normandy during World War II? Or was it maybe written in 1925 Tennessee? The where and when tells you about the world of the author. What else was going on in the world as the author was writing their opinion or account? If you're looking at a secondary source, how is the author's world different from the original author's world? Last but not least, we get around to asking the who questions. Who wrote the text? You might find author information at the beginning or the end of a text. Do they have a strong perspective? An author's point of view can have a huge impact on the text. What about the intended audience? Who was this text written for? The intended audience gives you much needed context for understanding what you're reading. A soldier's letter home is going to be different from an autobiography. Even if they're written by the same soldier, the audience would not be the same. Anyway, that's the basics of how to characterize a text. Care to give it a try?
I've mentioned this, off and on throughout the class. Active reading, right? So this is what you're doing in evaluating what you read. You ask those certain types of questions, and as she mentioned, a secondary source generally will have an opinion. It'll offer an argument, and I mentioned things like history books. So like the area I study, there's there's one history book called The American Way of War. It was written back in the 70s. And it is a history of sort of the American military experience. It talks about going back to like the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, Mexican-American War, and all these wars, and you get information, you learn the history of those events. But it's also offering opinion about that. The historian that wrote that had a specific idea about the changing nature of the American military that is put into that book. So, and that's, the same thing. You have to understand, well, what was the purpose for this, person writing? In his case, he was writing for an audience that wanted to better understand the American military. Who was he? He was a professor at Temple at the time. Again, we've talked about this, the credibility of an author. That was certainly within his wheelhouse to write something like that. So it's sometimes easier with secondary sources because a lot of times they're written more for a general audience or a modern audience. But with primary sources, you really have to think about, okay, this was not written for me, 99% of the time. Some writers, some speech writers and things will kind of understand that this might be an important moment in history and it'll be something that'll be remembered. But in most cases, particularly with stuff like a letter from a soldier, even, sort of newspaper articles and stuff like that were written the purpose is basically to provide news to an audience. That would have been the primary way that they would have received news about something like the Civil War. So that's something we also need to keep in mind. Who was that audience? Who was it written for? And also, just as important is who was writing it and why were they writing that? So let's take a look here.
Which of the following is the best way to characterize this text?
Okay, so looking at sort of evaluating the text that we have here, and thinking also about the title, the author, and always remember, usually we'll have some reference material at the end, that'll kind of show where we could find it if we would want to look at that in some other context or something like that, the source, and when it was published, where it was published, things like that. So this is recent. This is from 2008, and it was published, fictionally published in Los Angeles, California. Historical reflection. It's a fictional account. And the title is He Stood for We by Andrew Sapper. So in American history, Jackie Robinson is remembered primarily for his athletic excellence. However, as the first African-American to play modern Major League Baseball, many look to Robinson as a voice for the civil rights movement. With his 1958 letter to President Eisenhower, written half a century ago, Robinson demonstrated that he was willing to bring the same tenacity to the civil rights movement that he once brought to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Robinson speaks on his own authority and experience. He uses a first person, I, throughout the letter. He says, for example, I was in the audience and I felt like standing up. Using the first person shows that Robinson is personally accountable for his own opinion. He's not speaking on behalf of any group, movement, or political party. This letter is solely the voice of Jackie Robinson, famous athlete. That said, despite the first person I, Robinson doesn't air any personal grievances. Instead, he focuses on the African-American community as a whole, with himself as a member. He says, we have been the most patient of all people, and we want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we are entitled to as Americans. Robinson isn't concerned for himself. He's concerned about the 17 million African Americans that must wait for their entitled freedoms. Robinson didn't have to attend the summit meeting of Negro leaders. He didn't have to write a letter to President Eisenhower. Robinson could have used his fame and wealth to insulate himself from the world and its problems. Instead, he chose to be the I, standing up for the we. So there you go. You kind of get a better handle on why the title is "He Stood for the We." And we haven't really covered narrative, like the voice of a narrator, first person, which is something that we will get to eventually. But if they use I, meaning that they're writing about themselves, that is first person perspective. Third person would be using he or she pronouns, so talking about somebody else or a group. So just want to point that out. So looking at that, we are talking about a historical event or a historical piece period, 1950s, written in 2008. So we know this is a secondary source. He's discussing a primary source here based on Jackie Robinson's letter and things like that. So definitely a secondary source happening well after the actual events taking place in the 1950s. So we already know secondary source, and then it is an opinion. So this is a secondary source opinion written by a journalist in a magazine for history enthusiasts. This is as opposed to our other secondary source option, this is a secondary source account. It's more than just recounting the events of Jackie Robinson's life. He is offering this opinion about what Robinson meant to sort of the civil rights movement at the time. He's offering an opinion there as well. So, and largely, that's with sort of historical writing, as I've mentioned, a lot of times it'll have an argument, it's going to have an opinion. Not always. It might just be a recounting of events. That's a lot of like what the History Channel does. There's not like real strong arguments always made about historical events. They just share certain things that happen through history when they're not talking about UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever else is on the History Channel. But here he's certainly sort of asserting an opinion.
Great job! The author is writing in 2008 about something that happened in 1958. So this is a secondary source. Since the author isn't speaking from first-hand experience, this isn't an account. It's an opinion.
Right. So it can't be an account necessarily. Going with opinion. Secondary source most of the time will be opinion oriented.
Now that you can characterize a text, you're ready to compare and contrast between texts. That means you'll be looking at the ways in which two texts are the same or different from each other. I like to use a Venn diagram to help me visualize my frame of reference. The frame of reference is the topic of your comparison, including all ideas related to that topic. Let me show you what I mean. Recently, I read two texts about space travel. One text was a first-hand account by astronaut James Lovell about the Apollo 13 mission. The other text was a magazine article that looked back on the Apollo 13 mission 50 years later. Right away, I could see that the frame of reference for both articles was the Apollo 13 mission. So I'll label my Venn diagram here with that frame of reference. Since one text was an account and the other one was an opinion, the two texts did a lot of contrasting. Lovell's account included first-hand details of what went wrong with the Apollo 13. Lovell talked about feeling trapped in a damaged spacecraft, going days with little water or heat. It sounded really scary. The magazine author wasn't on Apollo 13, so he couldn't have written a first-hand account about what happened on the ship. Instead, the journalist put the mission into a historical context. The journalist had the benefit of 50 years of hindsight after all. The author talked about ground control's efforts to save Apollo 13. He also talked about the impact that the failed Apollo 13 mission had on the NASA space program. Despite their differences, the two texts had a lot in common. They're both talking about the same event, right? The two texts followed a similar timeline of events. Both texts referred to many of the same astronauts, engineers, and experts. Last but not least, both texts talk about the challenges faced by the Apollo 13 mission. Each author had different priorities on what challenges to talk about. Lovell's account focused on the challenges of survival. The journalist, however, talked about the economic challenges created by Apollo 13. Do you see what I've done here? The topics in the center of the diagram are points of comparison. The topics to the sides, here, are points of contrast, where the two texts are different. The Venn diagram shows you, at a glance, how these two texts are the same or different. Now all you need is to apply these basic principles to an actual text. Want to give it a shot?
So let's talk about Venn diagrams, because I don't think we've, this is a little new. And then Apollo 13, that was it would have been the third lunar landing. Apollo 11 was the mission with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins. That was the first one to, actually where we stepped foot on the moon. Apollo 12 was Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, I think. And then 13 was, sort of that infamous mission, the Tom Hanks movie, and their capsule was damaged on the way to the moon, so they couldn't complete the landing. They barely made it back. They had to do all this improvised construction and all this stuff, and it was really, really scary for them. But anyway, so Venn diagrams are great because they're a nice visual way when you're comparing and contrasting things. And you can have more than two bubbles. You could have, three bubbles or whatever that are overlap. So, the astronaut account, that's your primary source. So things that are exclusive to that go in that bubble, right? So as far as the account of what went wrong, the emotions, right? The physical toll, everything that Jim Lovell can discuss, giving a firsthand account of those events. Now, on the other side, you have the magazine opinion, right? So a secondary source, providing historical context, adding perspective by looking at the things that were happening sort of, by ground control, the things that were happening back here on Earth. And the impact of the failure. So again, that's sort of adding context as far as like the significance of the failure of Apollo 13, right? So that really is sort of the idea of history, right? It's not just about recounting, an event. It's also understanding the significance of it, the impact that it had, and that cause and effect relationship. And then right in the center, we have those comparisons. So on either side is the contrast. Those ideas are exclusive to those two documents. The common ground, right? So timeline, what they're actually discussing, right? The topic is, in both cases, Apollo 13. The people involved, right, are the same. And then, of course, the challenges of actually getting those astronauts home is also, relevant and appears in both documents. So Venn diagrams are a great way to visualize things, and very useful for qualitative types of information, right? Not something that you would probably use too much in a quantitative sense, right? You're not going to put numbers in that, but it's a qualitative way to express, information in sort of in a visually graphic way.
Which answer lists points of comparison between the two passages?
Okay, so now we have two passages to compare. And okay, the first one is Jackie Robinson's letter to President Eisenhower. The second one is that same passage from Andrew Sapper that we just read a few minutes ago. So let's take a look here. So answer points of comparison, right? So thinking about, sort of visualizing a Venn diagram. What are these two documents comparing, right? Not how they're different, but how are they the same? So point of comparison is where the two passages have something in common. So let's look at Jackie Robinson's letter. And just some background, this is really when the civil rights movement was starting to gain a lot of traction through the 50s, through the Eisenhower years. It really kind of, by the time we get to 1960, is in, just full force. We have those recognizable faces that are well, I guess by the late 50s, Martin Luther King Jr. and some other activists were really well known, or were basically household names. So this is really when it's starting to become really on the minds of most Americans. So May 13th, 1958, to the president, the White House, my dear president, I was sitting in the audience at the summit meeting of Negro leaders yesterday. When you said we must have patience, on hearing you say this, I felt like standing up and saying, oh no, not again. I respectfully remind you, sir, that we have been the most patient of all people. When you said we must have self-respect, I wondered how we could have self-respect and remain patient considering the treatment accorded us through the years. 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel are entitled as Americans. This we cannot do unless we pursue aggressively goals which all other Americans achieved over 150 years ago. As the chief executive of our nation, I respectfully suggest that you unwittingly crush the spirit of freedom in Negroes by constantly urging forbearance and give hope to those pro-segregation leaders like Governor Faubus, who would take from us even those freedoms we now enjoy. Your own experience with Governor Faubus is proof enough that forbearance and not eventual integration is the goal the pro-segregation leaders seek. In my view, an unequivocal statement backed up by actions such as you demonstrated you could take last fall in dealing with Governor Faubus, if it became necessary, would let it be known that America is determined to provide in the near future for Negroes the freedoms we are entitled to under the Constitution. Respectfully yours, Jackie Robinson. And I believe he is talking about Eisenhower having to call out the National Guard in Mississippi or Alabama. We'll talk a little bit more about that, to help desegregate schools. Once schools started to desegregate, there was, of course, a lot of pushback in the South, and he had to intervene. So again, the civil rights movement at this time was really heating up. And we have Robinson here discussing, and if you think about the other passage, right, the secondary source, you see that how he's using the first person. He is including himself in that discussion. So, making it clear, of course, where he stands, his background, and, of course, letting the president know his feelings that this is not something that can continue to wait. So, what is the point of comparison here then? It is civil rights, activism, and leadership, right? That is the ideas here. Of course, civil rights, the idea that, regardless of race, religion, or creed, we all share the same civil rights and liberties. Activism, of course, is Jackie Robinson being active in the civil rights movement, in the politics of the day. And then, of course, leadership on both sides, on that of Eisenhower, and Robinson himself showing himself as a leader in the civil rights movement.
Great job! Both texts discuss the need for leadership in the pursuit of civil rights and the individual's role in bringing about social and political change.
Yep. Okay. And
once you've compared and contrasted two texts, the last step is to identify the relationship and draw a conclusion. Drawing a conclusion means taking all the elements you've discovered and combining them into a statement. Your statement will be based on the relationship between the two texts. When comparing and contrasting, there are only 5 types of relationships that you're likely to see: extending, correcting, supporting, contradicting, or complicating. You might find more than one relationship between texts, but I'd focus on whichever one seems to be most significant. An extending relationship is when one text builds on the information given in another text. Remember the Venn diagram for the Apollo 13 mission? The magazine article put the Apollo 13 mission into historical context. If you read the first-hand account of Apollo 13 astronaut James Lovell, your knowledge would be extended by also reading about the historical context of the Apollo 13 mission. An extending relationship means that a second text adds to the information given in the first text. A correcting relationship is similar. A correcting relationship is when one text amends, repairs, or replaces information in another text. A supporting relationship is when one text reinforces the claims made in another text. I remember reading a Civil War court case about a man who was sentenced to prison for terrible crimes. There was some question whether or not the man was guilty or innocent. Years later, a historian wrote a research paper on the trial showing more evidence of the man's guilt. The historian's paper was supportive of the court case. A supportive relationship is when one text backs up claims made in another text. The opposite of a supporting relationship is a contradicting relationship. A contradicting relationship is when one text argues against claims made in another text or provides opposing information. Lastly, there's the complicating relationship. That's when one text gives concrete information that confuses or complicates the claims of another text. I remember reading a historical document written in 1722 that talked about the widespread crime in the province of Carolina. But then I read a second document that explained that many of Carolina's colonists were indentured servants. They were poor people cast out of England and forced to work in the colonies. Well, that certainly put a different spin on the first document. The second document suggested that the Carolina government might be partly responsible for the high crime rate. Once you identify the relationship between texts, your conclusion more or less writes itself. Your conclusion briefly explains, using details from the text, the relationship between the two texts. So if the information in one text extends the information of another, just explain how it does so. For example, remember my Apollo 13 diagram? Here's my conclusion. The magazine opinion extends the astronaut's account by also providing historical context and perspectives from ground control. See? Pretty easy. I could even use that conclusion as a thesis statement for an essay. Well, that's the basics of identifying a relationship and drawing a conclusion. Let's see if you've got this, shall we?
And yeah, so once if you're comparing and contrasting two articles or anything like that, that's something that it's either going to extend it or complement it or contradict it, right? So if there's the secondary source maybe evaluating the integrity of something or giving a different viewpoint. So that's something to think about once you've compared and contrast them, is that final idea of evaluating what you've read, the analysis of it, and stating your own sort of idea about the two sources, what is the relationship between the two. And this is this was my experience in grad school. This is what we did for an entire semester. We would look at history of, very specific, like the Vietnam War or, certain, periods of time or certain events. And throughout that semester, you read these different books, some, of course, they're all related topically because they're about, whatever historical event, but they look at different events within that, or they look at different perspectives. And then, we would basically write a midterm and a final paper, and it would, have to involve evaluating what we've read to sort of, make our own ideas about that, and and criticizing or critiquing what we read and the validity or the opinions of other historians. So this is something that's
Which
close to
answer draws the best
what
conclusion
historians
about the
do.
relationship between these texts?
Okay, so now looking at the conclusion. So last time we looked at that question 2, how are they related? What are the comparisons between those two documents? Now, what conclusion can we draw? Just like she was talking about the Apollo 13 missions and her conclusion there. So in this case, Sapper's article extends Robinson's letter using language analysis, right? So he points out how Robinson addresses himself in the first person in his letter. So he uses language analysis there. So the answer here is A. Supports Robinson's letter with historical context. That is not sort of the purpose of the article. In historical context, he doesn't give us a lot of information about what else is going on in 1958 when the letter's written. He's not talking about, the desegregation in the South and violence and protests and and things like that, marches. He's just talking about Jackie Robinson. And supports Robinson's letter using language analysis. No, it is largely extending sort of the idea.
Great job! Robinson's letter and Sapper's article have completely different goals. Robinson is trying to convince the president to allow African Americans the rights to which they are entitled. Sapper wants to extend your appreciation of the letter by pointing out the honor and nobility of Robinson's language choices.
Right. So helping you understand, right? That is extending the idea there. That's largely what Sapper is trying to do. His purpose there is deepening your understanding of Robinson's letter and him as a leader in the civil rights movement. And now we have our 8 questions.
Very good work on those excerpts.
So let's take about 15 minutes because there's several passages here. I believe there are things that we have already encountered. No, this is new. But I believe there are some other. No, this is all about the Gettysburg Address, basically. So there's basically going to be 2 accounts. You start with this one, then you'll have another document to look at, another passage, but everything is based on the Gettysburg Address here. So let's take about 15 minutes, work on that independently, and then we'll review and take a little deeper look into those questions. I'll stop my recording. So first up, it was asking us to characterize the text, right? So basically evaluating, is this a primary source? Is this a secondary source? And sort of the nature of it. Is it opinion, what have you. So this, as the, one thing with a lot of these passages and stuff, they're going to basically tell you right up front. So this is a letter written by politician and famous orator Edward Everett to President Lincoln following Lincoln's delivery of the Gettysburg Address. Everett was present at Gettysburg. He's delivered a much longer speech at Gettysburg right before Lincoln's address. Okay. And basically it was, complimenting Lincoln. We'll kind of skip over, the whole idea there, but basically sort of a thank you and expressing, how pleased he was with the ceremony that day. In 1863, just remembering here too, at the bottom, we have information where we could go see that. Of course, that's the Library of Congress. When it was accessed is there, 1995. Of course, we see that was written basically in 1863. Gettysburg Address online exhibition. So I guess on the Library of Congress website, they have like sort of curated a section on the Gettysburg Address that you can look at different documents there. So, so right away we know primary source. Okay, so after that, what do we have? It is a firsthand account, which actually includes some opinion about the speech. Okay, so firsthand account, generally a primary source, right? It's going to be, those are related. If it's a firsthand account, it means that person was at that event. So it's a primary source happening in that day and age. And it is opinionated, right? It's basically sort of pro Gettysburg Address, pro Lincoln, if you want to say so much, but you definitely see a viewpoint forming here. You could see that sort of with, to thank you very much sincerely for your great thoughtfulness for my daughter's accommodation on the platform yesterday, but permit me also to express my great admiration of the thoughts expressed by you. With such eloquent simplicity and appropriateness. Okay, so obviously that's his opinion of the Gettysburg Address given by Lincoln, and we'll get to contrast that here in a minute with a different take. But this is a primary source, firsthand account, includes some opinion about the speech. Okay, and then so we have another passage. A Voice from the Dead. These are excerpts from an editorial appearing in the Patriot and Union newspaper in 1863. Following Lincoln's delivery of the Gettysburg Address, the newspaper has since retracted this editorial. It's very critical of the speech. We've read the oration. I've talked about, sort of loaded language to help you identify the viewpoint somebody is taking. To say of Mr. Everett's oration that it rose to the height which the occasion demanded, or to say of the president's remarks that they fell below our expectations, would be alike false. Neither the orator nor the jester surprised or deceived us. So calling Lincoln a jester, whatever may be Mr. Everett's failings, he does not lack sense. Whatever may be the president's virtues, he does not possess sense. So, right, at least we're getting opinions about the two speakers, not very complimentary in either regards, a little less, a little softer on the other speaker. They stood there upon that ground, not with heart stricken with grief or elated by ideas of true glory, but coldly calculating the political advantages which might be derived from the solemn ceremonies of the dedication. We pass over the silly remarks of the president, right? Referring to what he said as silly. The Gettysburg Address, right? So now you see why they might have retracted this once some time had passed and realized this is one of the great speeches in American history. For the credit of the nation, we are willing that the veil of oblivion shall be dropped over them and that they shall be no more repeated or thought of. The dead of Gettysburg will speak from their tombs. They will raise their voices against this great wickedness and implore our rulers to discard from their counsels the folly which is destroying us, and return to the wise doctrines of the fathers, to the pleadings of Christianity, to the compromises of the Constitution, which can alone save us. So there's other things that you can kind of assume about these writers. They're not fans of the war, especially in that last line, right? The wise doctrines of the fathers, to the compromises of the Constitution, which can only save us. Very critical. So a point of contrast, right? So how do these things differ? So the appropriateness, the quality and sincerity of Lincoln's speech, right? So our first passage by Edward Everett is sort of praising Lincoln. Definitely sees that his address was appropriate, definitely of high quality, and definitely sincere, right? And what we have in the second passage there, absolutely the exact opposite, right? They basically like nothing about that. You would use something like that. This is really great here, because you can also see for historians, what we know a lot about Lincoln is that he was not particularly popular at the time. and not even often within his own party. So this is a good primary source to show you that there were people out there who did not always favor Lincoln. Again, history has sort of evaluated Lincoln and what he did, and put him in this place of history. But at the time, he was kind of awkward. He didn't have a good speaking voice. There's all this other stuff going on, and that sort of people just didn't always care for him. So so the editorial found the Gettysburg Address to be disrespectful to the dead and a thinly veiled political ploy. And a lot of that comes from the fact that it's fairly short. It's a rather short speech. So which answer draws the best conclusion now? So comparing the two, right? If we're going to conclude the relationship between these texts, so what is significant about the two in the relationship? So the editorial contradicts the letter of the quality of Lincoln's speech. So the editorial is opposed, right? They have two different viewpoints. It's contradicting the letter, which is saying that, oh yeah, it was great, great job, we all loved it, while the editorial is saying, no, it was horrible, you've disgraced us, blah 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 blah. And then here, like I've mentioned before, right, if you're sort of drawing conclusions, some of the things that you could say about comparing two different passages. So does it complicate the letter? Does the editorial extend the letter, right? So basically adding on to the praise given to the president in the letter. And then the third one, the editorial supports the letter, right? So no, it doesn't do any of that. It contradicts. So those are, sort of ideas that you can think about when comparing and contrasting two different passages. Does it complement? Does it support? Does it extend? Or does it contradict? Yeah, so Everett described Lincoln's words as eloquent simplicity and appropriateness. The editorial, right, I told you, watchful language, speak from their tombs in protest over Lincoln's speech, right? He called him silly. He said he didn't have any sense. So that's
Excellent.
sort of buzzwords there to sort of, get you in the mindset of, the opinions offered there. So this, all right, excerpts from an editorial appearing in the Patriot, the same thing. So what's the best way to characterize this text? It is also a primary source, right? It is written, this is where sometimes they get a little complicated. It's still a primary source because it's happening in the time period of the event. It is sort of a secondhand account because it uses other sources. But it's first and foremost, it is a primary source because of the time frame. It is written by a journalist, and it's of course meant to be read for the readers of the newspaper. So a primary source account written by a journalist in a newspaper for its readers. And so we eliminate the fact that it's a secondary source, still happening in the same time of the Gettysburg Address. I'm sorry, opinion, not account, opinion. I knew that looked wrong when I clicked on it. Yeah, right. So it's offering opinion. It's not just relating the fact that, it doesn't just reprint the Gettysburg Address. It doesn't talk about the crowd assembled or the weather that day, very sort of mundane aspects of it. It is offering what they thought about the Gettysburg Address and giving the readers their opinion. Yeah, so in the same time period, but that's where you have to be kind of cautionary as well in evaluating things. Even though it's a primary source because it happened in that time period, it's basically written after the fact, right? Within days, obviously, but they weren't actually writing that while they were listening to the Gettysburg Address. Okay, which answer lists points of comparisons between the two passages? Remember, point of comparison is where the two passages have something in common. So here, this is Edward Everett again. And then we have the same article that's offering sort of blasting Lincoln. So points of comparison, the importance of the ceremony, the pain of loss, and the dignity of the fallen, right? So the importance of the ceremony is addressed by both the pain of loss and the dignity of the fallen. That doesn't mean they don't differ on how those are addressed, but those are points made by both, right? So if you had your Everett letter and your editorial and your Venn diagrams, and you had them overlapping, those would be in the center there as far as points that are made by both. Differ on the effects, right? Differ in the opinion, but they both talk about those issues. Yeah, they both agree it's important. They both agree that the dead are due to respect. Everett, on the one hand, believes that that was accomplished. The editorial does not. And which of the following is the best way to characterize this text? So we won't go through, well, that's the same one again, isn't it? Yeah. I thought there was a different passage here at the end. Anyway. Oh, no. These are excerpts from Mary Shipron's, fictionalized account. So here at last, the ex-governor of Massachusetts. Yeah, so basically a recreation written in 1906. So right away, we understand, that's going to be a secondary source. It did not happen anywhere close to 1863. So it's a secondary source with an opinion written by an author for a magazine for readers. So secondary source, opinion, written by an author in a magazine for its readers. Not an account, right? Because it has sort of a glowing sort of, homage to Lincoln. Yeah, written obviously to, 40 years past the Gettysburg Address. And then here is comparing the two. So A Voice from the Dead, right? So the editorial again. So points of comparison between these two. So need for ceremony, human cost of war, and good of the country. So, obviously you can compare any two documents that are dealing with the same subject, and they're going to have sort of different points that they are making and different points of comparison. So here, need for the Gettysburg ceremony, human cost of war, and the good of the country. And then finally, so which answer draws the best conclusion between these two texts? Is the story contradicts the editorial on the quality of Lincoln's character, right? Again, we have one that's sort of, pro-Lincoln, sort of a glowing analysis of the Gettysburg Address, while the other one is very critical. So the story contradicts the editorial on the quality of Lincoln's character.
Well, that's it for the lesson on comparing opinions and accounts. I hope I was able to show you a thing or two about how history is written and how it's understood. You can think of history as a big library of stories. Some of the stories are truer than others, but even fictional accounts can tell you something about the time and place in which they were written. Always try to look past the face value of what a story is telling you. Never stop asking where and when something was written and who wrote it. Never stop thinking about who the story's intended audience was. History is important, very important, but it takes a little effort to sort it all out. Remember, all it takes is one credible story to change your entire perspective. Anyway, thanks for finishing my lesson. Press results and I'll tell you how you did.
Okay, so yeah, the most important thing with whatever you read, you know, whether it's historical, whether it's something contemporary, you know, when it was written, by who, what was the audience, what was the purpose? You want to get those questions in your mind, so they're automatic, and that will really help you. And then characterizing, that leads to characterizing what you're reading. Is this a primary source? Is it a first-hand account? Is it a secondary source, a second-hand account? You know, is it opinion? And when it comes to comparing and contrasting those things, you know, that will help you fill in the blanks. So, you know, typically if they're, you know, having something like that, obviously they're going to be about sort of the same topic, the same person, place, thing, or idea, and they may be coming from two different perspectives. They will not always disagree with each other. You know, just like the Sapper and Jackie Robinson, you know, one is sort of extending the ideas offered by them. So there's a whole list of ways that you would conclude the way those things are compared. Okay, so any question on comparing opinions and accounts?
Yes, Mr. Mark.
Yeah.
Do we have to do other things on social studies?
Do other things in social studies?
Yeah, like other lessons or?
Yeah. No. We're not close to finished. Like I said, we're going to work through the unit quizzes to get some review. Certainly tomorrow. We'll see how far we get because there's like 3 or 4 of them. So that's the next step for social studies. Then we're going to move away from essential ed, and I want to, you know, like I said before, the one thing that irks me about essential ed is it does not give you the knowledge that you need as far as history and civics, so that when you're, you know, asked questions in social studies, you know, it's just not going to be relying on what the text is. You need some background there. So we'll spend at least a good week or more on just, you know, learning some history, civics, and then we'll follow up with a battery of some practice exams. So get you guys looking at what the test will actually look like. So that's the plan basically from here on out. Is that good?
Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, so, and again, you know, the other thing about ideas like what we're doing here is that crossover between language arts and sort of comparing and analyzing, you know, passages. So any other questions? Okay, let's take about a 10-minute break. We're doing RLA reading today, so we'll get some more hitting up that critical thinking again in reading. So we'll take a break to about 1:40, and I'll see you guys back for language arts. All right, bye-bye.